I was sipping my morning coffee when I heard the chainsaws. Three of them, whining like angry wasps somewhere near the east edge of my property. That sound doesn't belong in a quiet Texas morning. Not without a warning, not without something being terribly wrong. I set my cup down, slid into my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. From where I stood, I could already see the sawdust dancing in the air like golden snow. My fence, the one my father and I built together in '68, was coming down, piece by piece, without a soul bothering to knock on my door. There were 5 of them, all wearing those bright orange HOA vests like they were on a highway crew. 2 were sawing, 1 was shouting directions, and the last 2 were tossing my fence posts into the back of a city truck like junk lumber. And right there in the middle of it all, arms crossed and smug as sin, stood Karen McAllister, president of the Homeowners Association of Willow Creek Lakeside Estates. She saw me and smiled like she just caught a raccoon in her attic. "Morning, Mr. Talbot," she chirped, voice sticky sweet. "We're just clearing up home code violations." I stepped off my porch, heart hammering. "You mind telling me what the hell you're doing on my land, cutting down my fence?" She didn't flinch. HOA Ordinance 14C clearly states that perimeter structures cannot extend more than 6 inches beyond the surveyed boundary. Your fence is 11.5 inches over. It's encroaching on community green space. We issued a notice last month. "No, you didn't," I snapped. "And even if you had, this is private property. You don't cut down a man's fence without a court order." Karen smiled wider, then gestured toward one of her clipboard cronies. "It's all legal. We had a board vote last week, emergency powers clause. You should have attended the monthly meeting." I looked down at the fallen fence posts, each one hand-cut, stained, and sunk deep into the hard earth by me and my father over 4 decades ago. I still remember the summer sun burning our backs, the smell of cedar and sweat, and how proud he was when we finished the last panel. This wasn't just a fence. It was history. It was boundary and blood. And these people were tearing it down like it was trash. "You've made a mistake," I said quietly, voice low and steady. "A real bad one." Karen snorted. "No, sir, you did, when you chose not to follow the rules." Then she turned on her heel and walked off like it was done and over, like I was just some stubborn old-timer standing in the way of progress. The chainsaws kept humming, the fence kept falling. I didn't yell, didn't call the sheriff, didn't make a scene. Instead, I walked back inside, finished my now cold coffee, and opened the drawer where I kept my land records, survey maps, and something else. Something I hadn't touched in 15 years. My license as a certified environmental systems engineer. I spent 40 years working for the state, designing sustainable land use systems, managing water flow and erosion, and building green infrastructure across Central Texas. I knew dirt like most men knew their wives. I also knew every inch of my property was exactly where it was meant to be. That night, as I stood staring at the jagged hole where my fence used to be, I made a decision. I wasn't going to rebuild it. I was going to reinforce it. With teeth. 2 weeks later, a shipment arrived. 200 mature opuntia cacti, each over 4 feet tall, with thorns sharp enough to pierce a boot sole. I spent every morning before sunrise planting them in a perfectly spaced perimeter around HOA property headquarters, the same building Karen had fenced off illegally on public land 5 years ago. I didn't say a word, didn't sign a petition, just dug and planted, one after the other, while the HOA watched from behind tinted windows. By the time I was done, the building was surrounded by a living wall of Texas-born fury, thorny justice rooted 12 inches deep. And that was just the beginning. You don't spend 40 years on a piece of land without knowing it like the back of your weathered hand. This place, my little slice of Texas, wasn't just property. It was legacy. My father bought it back in 1957 with his discharge pay after Korea. 22 acres of mesquite, red dirt, and freedom. Back then, there wasn't a neighborhood in sight. No paved roads, no rules written by folks who'd never touched a shovel in their life. Just us, a beat-up Ford pickup, and the dream of raising a family on soil we could call our own. We built everything here by hand. The barn, the well, the porch swing where my wife and I used to sit every evening with our lemonade and the sound of cicadas in the trees. That fence they cut down? That was the first real project I ever did with my old man. I was 16, sunburnt, sore, and happier than a hog in slop. And now it's the Willow Creek Lakeside Estates, a subdivision of mini mansions for retirees from California and lawyers who wanted a rustic lifestyle with full Wi-Fi and zero grit. HOA bylaws stacked thicker than the Bible, and a board full of folks who think living in the country means attending a wine tasting with boots on. At first, I didn't mind. They came in slow, house by house. They'd wave when they passed me mowing. Some even stopped by to chat, ask about my chickens or my tomatoes. I gave them eggs, taught one fella how to fix his riding mower. It was nice in its own strange way. But then came Karen. She moved in 3 years ago, 2 streets down in a place so fancy it had its own nameplate out front, the McAllister Homestead. That woman came in like a summer storm, loud, fast, and with the attitude of someone who thinks she invented the idea of community. She started small, little things, a flyer about neighborhood appearance, a suggestion to limit non-decorative farming elements, a note in my mailbox saying open pile composting is unsightly. I chuckled, tossed it, and figured she'd move on. She didn't. 1 month later, I got a formal citation. My fence was too rustic. The barn was an eyesore that lowered property value. I'd be fined $200 unless I repainted both structures in approved colors from the HOA palette. That palette, by the way, had 6 options. All beige. I called the HOA office. A kid with too much gel in his hair and not enough spine answered. Said they were enforcing cohesion and preserving aesthetic standards. I told him my barn had been that shade of red longer than he'd been alive. He didn't laugh. A week later, the fines doubled. Then came the warnings. About my dog barking, about the smell of my smoker, about unauthorized gatherings when my grandkids visited and played too loud in the yard. I appealed, went to the monthly meeting, sat through 2 hours of folks complaining about lawn gnomes and gutter colors, only to have Karen wave her hand and dismiss my request in 30 seconds. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Talbot," she said, flipping through her binder like it was the Constitution. So I pushed back. I sent letters, filed counter notices, even got a lawyer friend to draft a cease and desist for harassment. But Karen wasn't just a rule follower, she was a rule maker. The HOA board, handpicked by her and her bridge club cronies, passed new motions like clockwork. Everything suddenly required a permit. Birdhouses, clotheslines, even vegetable gardens. And folks, they let her. Not all, but most. You see, it's easy to ignore injustice when it ain't your fence getting torn down. Some neighbors kept their heads down, whispered apologies when we crossed paths. Others sided with Karen, glad to see the old ways getting cleaned up. Only a handful stood by me. The Simmons boy across the street, good kid, teaches shop at the high school. He offered to help repaint the barn just to avoid more fines. And old Mrs. Delgado from the corner lot brought me fresh cookies and called Karen a tyrant in pearls. But by then it wasn't about paint. It was about power. Karen wanted control, and I was the last holdout. My land, my history, it was a thorn in her beige plastic paradise. And when she couldn't shame me into submission, she decided to go for the throat. That's when she brought the county assessor into the mix. Next thing I know, I'm being investigated for unauthorized land use. Someone files a complaint that my shed is actually a second residence, that I'm violating zoning codes. It was laughable. Until the letters started coming, each one thicker than the last. I spent weeks buried in paperwork, proving that my shed was just a shed, that my property lines were exactly where they'd always been. But the damage was done. They stalled my well inspection, froze my permit renewal for the irrigation system I'd been maintaining since 1992. Then came the final straw. One morning I woke up to find my mailbox missing. Not knocked over, gone, post and all, dug clean out of the ground. In its place, a bright red HOA compliant mail station bolted onto a metal pole, standing 20 feet from my driveway. I stared at it for a long time. Not angry, just bored. Tired of the disrespect. Tired of the erasure. Tired of watching the land I'd cared for become a canvas for people who thought the smell of fresh manure was offensive. That night, I sat on the porch with my old dog, Charlie, and watched the sun dip below the cottonwoods. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the HOA clubhouse down the hill. Karen's voice rising above the rest like a queen in her court. I looked at the dirt beneath my boots, same dirt I'd walked since I was a boy, and I made a promise. If they wanted a war, they'd get one, but not with fire, not with fists, with roots, with thorns, with something older and tougher than Karen's rules. The morning after I planted the last cactus, I half expected a knock on my door. It didn't come. What did come was a bright yellow violation notice taped to my mailbox. What was left of it anyway. Unauthorized landscaping on HOA-adjacent public land, it read, complete with a $200 fine and a threat of legal action. Public land, huh? Funny. That plot, where I'd planted my army of prickly defenders, had once been part of a nature preserve buffer, until Karen quietly petitioned the county to designate it as, HOA-adjacent utility property, and built the HOA headquarters right in the middle of it. That was 5 years ago. No hearings, no vote, just a handshake deal with a county commissioner who happened to play poker with her husband. I'd done my homework. And now, after I'd turned her little power palace into a thorn-covered fortress, she was mad. Not just irritated, rattled. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. But I've lived long enough to know when people like Karen go silent, it's not surrender, it's planning. The first real blow came on a Tuesday. I was out back repairing a bit of fence along the south pasture when I heard Charlie, my old blue heeler, barking like the devil had shown up in a golf cart. I ran up the hill, heart in my throat, just in time to see an HOA van pulling away from the edge of my driveway. Charlie was gone. There was no note, no knock, no explanation, just a voicemail on my landline an hour later. "This is the HOA Animal Welfare Committee," a robotic voice said. "We've received reports of an unlicensed and aggressive dog on your property. The animal has been detained for community safety pending behavioral evaluation and compliance review." They stole my dog. Charlie had been with me 14 years. He was arthritic, half-blind, and wouldn't bite a biscuit, let alone a person. He'd never hurt a soul, but he had barked at Karen once, loudly, right after she trespassed to measure my rose bushes. That was enough. I called animal control, the sheriff's office, the HOA office. No answers. By day 3, I was ready to drive down to the pound and raise Cain. But just before I left, a neighbor slipped me a folded note under my door. "Check the construction site behind the clubhouse. 2 a.m. No lights." I didn't know who sent it, but I knew where it led. That night, I parked my truck half a mile down the county road and walked in under moonlight. Past the dry creek bed, through the sycamore grove, and there, behind the HOA clubhouse, was a half-built structure surrounded by plastic fencing. Inside a makeshift kennel, behind 2 padlocks and a security camera, was Charlie. Dirty, scared, alive. I got him out the only way I knew how, with bolt cutters and a whisper. I carried him home wrapped in my coat, heart pounding, shaking with more than just age. The next morning, another notice appeared. This one read, "Pet recovered from HOA evidence holding. Tampering with community property under investigation. Formal hearing scheduled." Hearing? No, this wasn't a hearing, this was war. That week, the attacks came faster. A county inspector appeared at my door with a clipboard and a bad attitude, claiming a tip about unsafe wiring in my barn. My utility bill doubled overnight. "Leak detection," they said. 2 pine trees on the west side of my property were chopped down by mistake by an HOA landscaping crew. And worst of all, my irrigation lines, old but perfectly functional, were suddenly dug up and sealed off, pending new HOA water management policy. I confronted the crew mid-job. One guy muttered, "We're just following orders." I asked whose orders. He didn't answer. That night, I stood at the edge of my now dry garden and realized they weren't just harassing me anymore. They were erasing me, root by root, inch by inch. That's when the community started to crack. Some neighbors began to whisper in my defense. I'd catch glimpses, Miss Delgado staring daggers at Karen's golf cart as it passed, the Simmons boy shaking his head while watching crews accidentally dump gravel on my driveway. One woman, Linda, from 2 doors down, came by with a peach cobbler and eyes full of guilt. "I didn't vote for her," she said softly. But I didn't stop her either. We're all scared. She's got everyone by the throat. Turns out Karen had been using HOA funds for more than just newsletters and garden flags. She'd given consulting stipends to board members, hired her niece as a landscaping consultant, rented out HOA property for private events, and kept the money. Rumors swirled, but nobody wanted to speak up, because Karen didn't just cut down fences, she cut down reputations. One man's daughter didn't get her HOA scholarship after he questioned a policy. Another family had their house repainted without consent after they put up a rainbow flag. Fear was her fertilizer. But I'm not afraid of weeds. So I went to the next HOA meeting, not as a complainer, not as a victim, as a man with nothing left to lose. I walked into that clubhouse, still surrounded by my 200 loyal cacti, and stood in front of a crowd that looked everywhere but at me. Karen was seated at the center table, smile painted on like lacquer. She began her speech about maintaining harmony and vision, but I raised a hand. I have evidence, I said, of misuse of HOA funds, illegal land alteration, unauthorized surveillance, and theft. That got their attention. From my jacket, I pulled a folder thick with photographs, transaction records, and county maps. I'd spent weeks gathering them, quietly while they were busy digging up my land. I handed it to the secretary, then looked Karen in the eye. Your rules don't override the law, I said, and you've crossed the line. For the first time in 3 years, Karen didn't have a snarky comeback, just a flicker of something behind the eyes. Panic. There's a silence that falls in a room when the truth walks in. Not the kind of silence you get at church or during the national anthem. No, this silence had weight. You could feel it pressing down on every set of shoulders in that HOA clubhouse. I stood at the podium, folder still warm in my hand, the air thick with nerves and cheap lavender air freshener. Karen's smile had slipped a full inch. She blinked once, twice. Her knuckles whitened on the armrests of that ridiculous high-back chair she had special ordered for herself. This, I said, tapping the folder, is a record of every dollar misappropriated from the HOA budget for the last 3 fiscal years. It includes copies of checks written to her niece for landscape consultation, despite no actual work being performed. It includes photographs of HOA equipment being used for private parties at Karen's home. And maps, county stamped, showing that this building is sitting on protected greenbelt land she had rezoned behind closed doors. I paused, scanning the room. Some heads turned toward Karen. A few folks shifted in their seats. One man in the back removed his glasses, slowly, like he was watching a house of cards start to wobble. Now, I ain't a lawyer, I said, but I spent 40 years writing environmental compliance reports. If even half of what's in here is true, and it is, you're looking at not just a violation of HOA bylaws. You're looking at county violations, state violations, possibly federal, depending on how she filed the zoning paperwork. Karen opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, it was Tom McGrady, vice president of the board, and until that day, Karen's most loyal supporter, who cleared his throat. Mr. Talbot, he said slowly, you're making some serious accusations. I nodded, and I brought serious proof. I reached into a second folder, this one thinner but no less important, including recordings, emails, testimonies from past HOA staff who were pressured to falsify budget reports. Tom took the folder like it was on fire. And Karen, she stood. For a split second, I thought she might come clean, say something to save face, but Karen didn't do confession. She did deflection. This is a personal vendetta, she snapped, her voice echoing off the drywall. This man has been hostile to progress since day one. He's resisted every effort to bring order and safety to our community. Now he's resorting to slander. I didn't move, didn't flinch, just pulled out one last envelope. Inside this, I said, is a copy of the easement agreement you forged my signature on, the one used to justify dismantling my fence without a permit. I had it analyzed. The signature doesn't match my legal one on record. I can get a handwriting expert to testify. Gasps. Audible gasps. Tom's eyes widened. You forged documents? Karen turned to him, red-faced. It was necessary. That fence was in violation. You committed fraud, Karen. The room was fully awake now. Someone from the back muttered, "You've gone too far." Another voice. She took money from the hurricane fund too, didn't she? Karen's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted between the faces, people she thought were loyal, compliant. Her court of well-trimmed lawns and beige-painted facades was fracturing right before her eyes. She turned back to me, desperation creeping in. You think you've won, Talbot? All because you brought some papers and played Perry Mason? You think these people care about your vendetta? They don't. They care about property values and peace of mind. I raised an eyebrow. Peace of mind, I said softly. Is that what you gave my dog when you locked him in a cage for 3 days? Is that what you gave me when you dug up my irrigation, cut down my trees, and trespassed on my land? She faltered, and then I played the final card. From my coat pocket, I pulled a small black USB stick. This contains footage from the security cam I installed after Charlie was taken. It shows your HOA crew entering my property without a warrant, digging, cutting, and laughing while they did it. You said there was a vote? I requested the HOA board minutes. There was no vote. You lied. Tom stood abruptly. Meeting adjourned, he said, voice tight. Effective immediately, I'm placing Karen McAllister under internal investigation pending legal review. Karen opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. The room buzzed to life, people murmuring, chairs scraping back. She stood alone now,